To call China an economic powerhouse is hardly a controversial statement. But when we begin to discuss Beijing's military capabilities, things get a little more complicated. The People's Liberation Army is a powerful force. But just how powerful exactly? And most importantly, what are its strategic objectives? Good evening, my name is Mateusz Mazzini, and this is Wider View. Our main story tonight focuses on Chinese military doctrine. The conventional wisdom among Western societies is that although China has been gaining military strength in recent years, it still falls behind the capacities of the US and European powers. We also tend to think that all armies in the world are commanded the same way and follow the exact same principles. But the People's Liberation Army, as it is officially known, is governed by a different logic. China is already a military superpower and aims to strengthen its international position, although its methods are very different from the Western ones. How exactly does Beijing want to project influence onto other countries? We explore that first question in our next report.
2027 marks the centennial anniversary of the establishment of the People's Liberation Army. Over the last decades, its structures have undergone impressive modernization, allowing it to become one of the most powerful militaries globally. Beijing is already number 2 in the world when it comes to defense spending, second only to the United States. It's hard to say with any certainty how many active members the PLA has, but credible estimates have been published by Western think tanks. According to War on the Rocks, a defense news platform, the PLA now numbers around 2 million active duty personnel. If needed, that number could be significantly increased by over 1 million reservists. In addition, some 600,000 paramilitary troops are also trained and could be combat ready in a matter of weeks. Nobody could send more people to fight for their country than Xi Jinping. But the power of the PLA lies not only in its extensive human resources. It commands a fleet of 4,000 aircraft, 2,500 of which are combat units. In recent decades, it's also modernized its navy and become a global powerhouse in semi-autonomous weapons. But at the same time, China has developed its own military strategy. It offers extensive training services for domestic security forces, such as police officers from other countries. It doesn't invest much in its military presence overseas, having just one foreign base in the African country of Djibouti. Defense and security are clearly among Xi Jinping's main policy focuses, and it's high time the West paid more attention.
Is China a global military superpower? Are there any aspects in which it is already beating the United States or Europe? And what is it that the Chinese do differently compared to other players on the international stage? We still have a significant deficit of information on China, but our experts will help bridging that gap. I'm pleased to say, joining me tonight are François Godemont from Institut Montaigne in Paris, Professor Joachim Krups from the University of Leiden, and Suyash Desai, a research scholar based in Taipei. Gentlemen, good evening and welcome to Wider View. And I wanted to begin with you, François, and ask you to kind of set the scene here for us. What are the main principles, the main foundations, if you please, of the Chinese strategic defense and military doctrine, and what are its primary objectives? So how does China aspire to both become or maintain the status of the military power domestically, but also project strength onto other places?
The PLA doctrine is evolving. It's no longer what it was 20 years ago. It was indeed strictly defensive and linked to the protection of the China's economy, very integrated with the protection of China's economy, very land-based, or based on the just the surroundings of China. But in the past 25 years, China is perhaps the only country whose defense spending has risen every year, never opposed. Even if we take the base figure for China's military budget, it's risen at twice the rate of all its Asian neighbors on the average. So the situation has changed. In terms of projection, it is not yet a global military power. It projects forces. It has even conducted in 2017 a circumnavigation of Europe together with Russian Navy. That's, impressive enough to note. It's more present than others on any given day, and especially more present, for example, than our own French Navy in the Mediterranean. But as the documentary says, it lacks Beijing. It has a little more than Djibouti, actually. It has a lot of stopping rights and has ways to stock logistics in advance. Nothing compared with the facilities of the US Navy. It has impressive numbers. By 2030, it's expected that it will have 50% more ships than the US Navy itself. Mm-hmm. The question, of course, is about the quality, about the ability to fight in a coordinated way, and about the use of IT. Mm-hmm. That's
well,
one
I guess the question over the made in China products is a perennial one when we discuss the People's Republic, independent of the actual topic. But I wanted to move to you, Soyash, and ask a little more specific of a question. You're a keen observer of the People's Liberation Army and the changes it undertook in the recent years. How much of a technological leap did it experience over the last years or decades, in particular under Xi Jinping? Is there a difference between how he approaches military modernization compared to other leaders?
Yes, there is a great leap forward in comparison to what was happening in the past and what is happening in the present. The Chinese military doctrine is based on the framework called active defense, which is, in simple terms, also known as offensive defense. Now, since 2016-2017, when China has started mobilizing its cyber and military power into active defense, they have leapfrogged into technological military, especially military technology. And this process started under Xi Jinping in 2015, 2016, 2017. And now, for example, areas such as hypersonic technologies, in comparison, in military to military comparison, US is still very powerful. But if you compare some aspects of technological integration into Chinese military, China is leaps and bounds ahead of United States. And
that is a very detailed description of what we have on the ground in China. So thank you for that, Soyash. But we're going to zoom in and zoom out in this show. So I want to zoom out right now. And on that note, turn to you, Joachim, and take a broader perspective here. One of the main differences between the Western powers doing defense and security and China is precisely the fact that China doesn't really invest much in providing external security, as we've seen the base in Djibouti, and hardly anything else, very different to what the United States of America, for instance, do. But also, China also invests a lot in domestic security by providing training to a lot of police forces. I think it's over 75% of African countries that have had some kind of deals in police training with China. Why is that?
Yeah, no, thanks a lot. Indeed, so China cannot rival the US in terms of overseas bases, military bases. The US has built this up over 80 years. It's part of a global strategy. China has built since 2017 a base in Djibouti, as was mentioned. There's also some indication of Cambodia, and depending on the estimates and reports of Western analysts, you can also expect that China is looking to expand it, or at least looking into potential bases of more than a dozen, even though that it hasn't taken place yet. It doesn't have to also, we could argue, because it connects quite closely military and security goals with the Belt and Road Initiative. So commercial ports and key deals with a variety of countries can also be used as a dual use base, so to say, so where maybe in the future also military and security activities could take place. Because China is keen to conclude comprehensive agreements with a wide range of countries in strategic regions. Now, to your point about the domestic security dimension, indeed, you could say the security concept of China always has been, or of the Communist Party always has been, a internal, external nexus where, of course, internal security is supreme. So if you think about the Ministry of Public Security, which also runs the police forces, police officers first swear allegiance towards the Communist Party, then the state, then the people, and then maybe something remote to the rule of law. And the rule of law has to be essentially subjugated to what the Chinese call wei wen, so stability maintenance. And for stability maintenance, that can also be including anti-rioting, protests.
I'm going to have to interrupt you here because this is where we have to pause our discussion. And it evidently seems from what you're saying that ideology trumps everything in China. Thank you, gentlemen, very much for your answers so far and for obviously shedding more light on the military aspects of Chinese development and economic leaps. But the elephant in the room, just like in the case of any discussion over China, is of course Taiwan. So now let's take a look at where Beijing stands on this issue. Fears of a possible military conflict over this island, located just 200 miles off the coast of mainland China, have been mounting for years now. There is no clear indication that Xi Jinping has already decided to invade, just as there's nothing to suggest that he will never do so. Our second report summarizes what we know about this dispute and where it might end.
Taiwan, officially known as the Republic of China, is recognized as a sovereign state only by 11 other countries. Recognizing Taiwanese statehood is usually tantamount to severing ties with Beijing. The government in Taipei has repeatedly petitioned to be allowed into the international community. Its requests have invariably been blocked by vetoes from the People's Republic. Every mainland Chinese leader so far has considered Taiwan a rebel island whose territory is an integral part of their country. But no one else in modern history has been as outspoken about the issue as Xi Jinping. For him, reunification seems to be a primary strategic goal. According to some predictions, the year 2027, marking the 100th anniversary of the PLA, could provide a perfect opportunity for that. Chinese military forces regularly destabilize Taiwanese positions through exercises and drills. Incursions into the island's airspace and territorial waters happen weekly, sometimes even daily. It's easy to understand that in the event of a full-scale invasion, Taipei would require external help. Whether that help will come is a different story. A possible American defensive intervention would require a lot of geopolitical conditions to be met. It would also shake up the regional balance of power and affect other countries, especially Japan and South Korea. The incoming Trump administration is also a major unknown, as it might want to avoid any direct conflicts. On the other hand, it's likely to be dominated by China hawks. Under these circumstances, tensions over the island are likely to remain high.
What would have to happen for the invasion, or annexation if you please, to become plausible or even likely in terms of geopolitical conditions? Is Trump 2.0 going to make it more likely or less likely? Especially, and here a little bit of breaking news, we've just learned, quoting the New York Times, that the United States of America executed a successful prisoner swap with the People's Republic of China, apparently also including an FBI agent. What does it tell us?
That's the Biden administration in its final weeks or months. It says nothing about the Trump administration. And right now, I would think that Xi Jinping and his colleagues are intent on showing goodwill to Trump's predecessors and also to allies, even if it's only token words, if only to sharpen the contrast when Trump comes in. And you're very right, Arthur, your commentary is very right. The lineup so far for the future Trump administration is heavily leaning towards countering China, whether it's at defense or State Department or Treasury or Commerce or NSC, National Security Council, where the incoming guy has displayed total solidarity with the outgoing guy from the Biden administration. So that's very strong. What it would require I think, for a U.S. intervention, if that's what you're looking for, is, I think, a blockade of Taiwan that would effectively cut off Taiwan in terms of resources, but almost more importantly in terms of exports, particularly the chips, the semiconductors, for which Taiwan is a worldwide strategic asset with a nearly total dominance of the area. So you don't need an actual conflict. And what is worrying is that following, as has been described, the heightened incursions into Taiwan, the last ones over this summer include Coast Guard exercises, surround the island instead of being only on one coast, and clearly mimic what would happen if China wanted to take administrative control, jurisdictional control over Taiwan's overseas links. So this is where we are. There are 9 cases where the PRC has declared it could act militarily against Taiwan. Not only a declaration of independence, it's also civil strife or political chaos on the island. Lots of pretexts which could be used.
And not particularly specific ones, to be exact. Joachim, on that note, I want to turn to you and ask a few questions about the regional landscape. A possible military conflict of any nature over Taiwan would inherently destabilize Asia, but how exactly? So how would regional powers like Japan or South Korea react to that situation? Would they seek more security umbrella from the United States, or would they actually be happy with what they have already?
No, everything depends at the end, indeed, of the reaction of the US. And there are still quite a few question marks. You already in the last couple of years saw a kind of twofold alliance system emerging. So, of course, there's a very strong alliance between Australia, Japan, and the US and other Western powers, and they have strengthened that in the last years, both as an indication, of course, of potential threats and escalations in that region from China. But also China has been trying to build up alliances with the Pacific Islands 2 years ago. So, Kiribati, Fiji, Vanuatu, Papua New Guinea, to create security pacts as a counterbalance. So you have these indirect alliance buildings that are kind of function of the confrontation.
But I'm going to jump on this. I'm going to jump on this straight
side.
away and ask you a follow-up question. What is the added value of having alliances with countries like Vanuatu or Kiribati? I know that it projects strength, but does it translate to anything tangible?
It does. It gives you naval port access. It also can be quite useful in terms of maritime routes and the so-called island chain strategy. So trying to not only send a signal symbolically, but also really in terms of logistics, to have bases or quick access to these countries. And that's also why the Solomon Islands Security Pact 2 years ago, you could say very small island, who really cares, raised alarm bells in the West and also in the US, because it's a very clear indication of this kind of counter alliances and maritime security buildup that we now witness.
Mm-hmm. And on the final note, back to you, Francois, and a very specific question about the different form of power projection, which is military munition exportation. We know that China is not just an economic powerhouse, a military powerhouse, it also produces a lot of armaments. Who are the main recipients of Chinese weapons?
It used to be, let's be frank, poor country with second-grade armament needs. Not really mainline, because Chinese weapons were cheap, abundant, but not first grade. I do make an exception now with something that's been underlined, the drones phenomenon, where the Chinese are very advanced. But we now, of course, have the Russian, not exactly buyer, it's a seller to China, but it buys components which it is using for its own war machinery. This is not the main aspect, however. There are missiles which can be sold, for example, to the Middle East. And in the past, they have played a role in Gulf Wars, for example.
And are they being sold to the Middle East already? Do we know?
They have been, for example, I mean, it's not even remembered now, but even Saudi Arabia has bought mid-range intermediate missiles in the past, made a deal with China. Iraq in its own days, Iran, of course, some of the weapons that I use, including by the Guardians of Revolution, are Chinese. Of course, it's there. But I would like to emphasize much more something that hasn't been underlined at all, which is China's rising nuclear profile. We used to think of it, as the Chinese deterrent, a bit like the French deterrent, the ultimate defense when everything else has failed. Well, now we're going to have probably not 200 or 300 warheads, but maybe 1,000, maybe 1,500 over the next 10 years, with lots of missile sites in Western China, a complete different profile. And at the same time, even though China advocates theoretically no first use, you can read military writings with exactly like Putin's Russia, mention the possible use of nuclear weapons, tactical nuclear weapons, if core interests are threatened. So widening.
A very important piece of the military doctrine to pay attention to. I'm afraid this is all we have time for tonight. There is no doubt that China is already a military superpower, but to what extent it actually threatens the liberal order, that's a lot more complicated. Suyash Desai, Professor Joachim Krups and François Godemain were our guests tonight. Thank you for being with us and have a good evening. As a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council and a technological powerhouse, China will likely remain the dominant Asian military actor for decades to come. It doesn't fully endorse the liberal world order, but still acts as a stabilizing factor. The problem is, not everyone always wants the sort of stability that Beijing provides. Thank you for being with us tonight. Next week, we will take a deep dive into a permanently understudied country as we look at what's next for Iran. Make sure you're with us next Thursday and have a good evening.